Hello and welcome to Fit to Speak. I'm Eugene Obah. So glad to have you with us. Well, it's a Barbenheimer world out there, and we just happen to be living in it. And speaking of the World Cup is underway in the lands down under, and a different kind of football may very well be going under and hanging on by a thread. I'll be talking a bit about that in a few minutes, and no, I'm not talking about the latest social network from Mark Zuckerberg. Later in the show, Philly Sports Network lead writer Regina Ham joins us to discuss the developments of the impending merger between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf, the latter of which is funded by Saudi Arabia, and the implications this could have across all sports. But first, it's officially official, and it's unanimous. The owners of the teams that comprise the National Football League voted this past Thursday to approve the sale of the Washington Commanders, now owned by a group led by Josh Harris, to the tune of a record $6 billion. The pep rally was done to celebrate. Harris stated in part, quote, "From day one, it is our top priority to deliver you a championship caliber team, and we will strive every day to ensure that we are a franchise you can be proud of. To Commanders fans everywhere, our promise is simple. We will do the work, create the culture, and make the investment needed to deliver for this team and for Washington." Oh, and on the way out, previous owner Dan Snyder was fined $60 million. I think this remark I made during my commentary in the April edition of the program says it all. As far as I'm concerned, while Danny Boy will be laughing all the way to the bank, I can assure you that the Anacostia River will not be filled with anybody's tears. Commanders fans, I think you all very well deserve to cry tears of joy. Congratulations, Commanders fans. Congratulations. Thus far, the World Cup has been very exciting to watch, and given the time difference between the US and New Zealand and Australia, there have been quite a bit of late night games, which certainly fits my sensibilities. Owners of restaurants in DC are probably saying this is what dreams are made of, but in American football, gridiron as it were, Daryl Johnston, aka Moose, is probably having nightmares. I'll explain how in just a second, but earlier this month, in case you haven't heard, the USFL ended their second consecutive season, and just like last season, the Birmingham Stallions won. Congratulations to them. But going back to why Johnston, who is the president of the USFL, and Fox, which owns it, are probably having not so sweet dreams, allow me to read one of Mr. Johnston's statements in which he was baffled by the drop in the league's ratings, 16% to be precise. Quote, "You put our game on television up against our competition. There is no competition. We are far superior in production value, far superior in on-air talent, recognizable names, recognizable voices. We're pushing the envelope with all the technology we have. To me, to be on par with our competition from a ratings standpoint in year two, I'm still trying to figure out how did that happen? Because our products, in my opinion, when I watch it, they're not even close." How did that happen? How about the fact that it happened in spite of the fact that the league had more consistent broadcast windows and had much better distribution than the XFL? Remember that the XFL had only one broadcast network to the USFL's two. And how about the fact that there was more energy in the exclamation point in Jeb Bush's failed presidential campaign side than the vast majority of USFL games? But seriously, this is part of what I mentioned in the May edition of the program. Well, for starters, nobody wants to see empty stadiums. Nobody wants to see empty stadiums, not to mention hearing loud, buzzy drones. The contrast is jarring. Watching, for example, the New Orleans Breakers and the Pittsburgh Ballers of the USFL, and keep in mind they don't play either in Pittsburgh or New Orleans. Well, watching that game on FS1 after coming home from Audi Field and seeing the DC Defenders, I'm sorry, that was right there. Watching that USFL game alone, what was the equivalent for me of televised Ambien. Now I know the USFL groupies gnash their teeth every time somebody points this out, but the truth hurts. Real football, yes, real football is played in front of fans. Speaking of real football, that leads actually to another reason why the USFL declined.
This is for the real ones, the fans that live for this. This is the USFL, reborn from the OGs. This isn't some Hollywood knockoff. This is Dragons, USDA primetime football. Just ask these guys.
You better recognize the real.
Accept no substitutes.
This commercial ran in the run-up to their season, and obviously this was a shot at the XFL. Note that the uniform seen here is similar to the colors of the San Antonio Brahmas of the XFL. It showed that the league had absolutely no confidence whatsoever in their product. No confidence whatsoever. Very, very insecure. Instead of talking about the league on its merits, such as they are, gameplay, maybe, etc., they choose to bash other leagues, well, mainly bash the XFL. Trying to take on the NFL did not work for the original iteration of the XFL, and also did not work for the original iteration of the USFL. The new XFL have taken the high road as they should, and they have much more reason to celebrate. The demos for the championship game, specifically in the 1849 demo, and the overnights and final ratings were much higher than the USFL. Remember, higher demos means that Disney, which owns ESPN, ABC, and FX, can set higher rates for ads. I find it a bit amusing, by the way, that the USFL's demo rating for the championship was behind reruns of America's Funniest Home Videos. The stands were busy laughing at the XFL's ratings earlier this year, but they were not laughing in May when I put up this graphic illustrating that on average, the XFL beat last year's USFL. And now that both leagues have completed the season in the same year, the XFL's viewership on average still beat the USFL. And look at that decline in broadcast. Yowza! It's a sight to behold for the wrong reasons. And let me point out that even with a Kentucky Derby lead-in during Week 4, there was no increased interest in the league. And even after the XFL completed its season, it was the same story. No increased interest when the USFL had the market to itself after Week 5. Another thing that was quite telling after the championship was this tweet from journalist and writer Mike Mitchell responding to a question as to whether or not NBC, which, keep in mind, just airs some of the games, was happy with the ratings. The answer from all indications? No. Keep this in mind if or when NBC gets the NBA rights in 2025. And then there's this from last year in which the ad agencies were guaranteed about a 2.6 million viewership average. Nowhere near that happened last year or this year, and even if the guarantee was half that, I mean, we don't have numbers for this year, but let's just say that it was, the league would still have to provide make goods, i.e. free ads, and more likely than not, there were plenty where that came from. In totality, it is clear that the USFL as an overall product is not exactly appealing to enough of the public, certainly not to younger viewers, which represents a real growth opportunity if the league is to survive. Intangibles matter, optics matter, and the league has not done itself any favors in either of those regards. Now, Fox, they aired Super Bowl ads, which makes the USFL's ratings even less impressive. What's worse is that the hub model, albeit with some adjustments, whatever those are, will continue next year. If Moose thinks that his league has any chance of becoming a permanent fixture in the sports world as presented, especially given the lawsuit that the parent company is still staring down the barrel at from Smartmatic, remember them? And not to mention another defamation lawsuit, this time from a supporter of former U.S. President Donald Trump, then I'll just say that dog don't hunt. Even with this Forbes article, which cited the $60 million cost that the XFL took this year, though much of that could be attributed to startup costs, the league is expecting $100 million in revenue. I'd much rather be in a position that the XFL is in than the USFL is in, and the public agrees with me. Some things are going to have to change, and they're going to need to happen in short order. Otherwise, Daryl Johnston and all the USFL trolls out there will have no choice but to
what the XFL is cooking.
And joining me now is Regina Ham, the lead writer of the Philly Sports Network. Regina, welcome to the show. It is great to have you on. And
Thank
let's
you,
go
Gene.
ahead and get started. Yeah, absolutely. This is to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation because a lot of stuff going on with this stuff with the PGA Tour right now and LIV Golf. I mean, I can't say I'm a purveyor of golf necessarily, but this news was seismic. I thought when I was sitting in DC, I was like, whoa, this is a huge deal. And then I was reading this article in The Guardian, which I think encapsulates that feeling. And I'll say this here, quote, the wider significance here is the concussive speed and devastating lack of transparency in which this transaction was conducted. And we know that LIV Golf is funded by Saudi Arabia, the PIF, the Public Investment Fund. And the article went on to say that the circle of trust, according to a report in the New York Times, was deliberately kept as small as possible. Even most of the PGA Tour board had no idea that this was happening. And, this goes on to say the brazenness, the wall of silence, the smoke and mirrors, the decision to present this deal to the world as a fait accompli. This is all part of the performance. The projection of power matters as much as the power itself. It says to the world, we bonesaw the journalists, we brought golf, and you didn't even know anything was happening. And this obviously refers to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, of the Washington Post, and the litany of human rights violations in Saudi Arabia is very, very well documented. So, on the back of all this, Regina, what did you make of this merger? What did you make of this news?
Well, when this merger happened, it rocked the sports world because, as you mentioned, Eugene, the LIV Golf tournament and the PGA had we'll call it a brief, weird detente for a while. Their players were leaving the PGA Tour to go play with LIV because they were offering these $1 million contracts that you were not going to get playing in the PGA Tour. You saw many famous names jump ship to go play in this Saudi-backed group, as you mentioned. And of course, backlash abounded. You had the 9/11 survivors organization that chided players who went to play there. You had lots of questions, as you mentioned. Saudi Arabia is backed by Mohammed bin Salman. That's the PIF's backer. He is notoriously linked, as you mentioned, to the murder of Khashoggi. So you have all these questions that came up when it happened. The two entities essentially were going to make the PGA Tour and LIV Golf's commercial businesses into one new package. Has not been named yet, obviously. This tour would also include the PGA's European Tour, which is called the DP World Tour. Now, as we've mentioned, and as you've alluded to, this is the second stunning sports deal at the time in months that has been a massive merger. But it's been a bigger story because of who is backing it. Now, I have to say, Sally Jenkins, she's Washington Post sports writer. She's fantastic. She's covered this a lot. She gave a really interesting interview where she talked about this is something we have not seen before. This is not something we as Americans are used to seeing before in our sports deals. And the fact that you have someone with such a a sovereign backing, as you will. And I believe she said that 20% of funds that can be given to a public entity usually can come from sovereign nations. This is unheard of. So you're going to have a lot of conversation around, okay, Saudi Arabia is now backing America's one of their prime institutions. Let's not mince words about that. The PGA Tour, whether you or I are golf people or not, is an institution. I mean, the green jacket going to Augusta, that's
Right.
having the Masters, that's a big deal. And I feel like this has kind of been a little bit under the radar in the sense that, not that people haven't been paying attention, people didn't actually dig into what's involved in this. And I think if they did, they'd be very surprised at the terms of this deal.
Yeah, and there's going to be a Senate hearing on this. I should note for our viewers that we're recording this prior to this Senate hearing, which took place on July 11th. But there are some interesting things, Regina, with the commissioner and the timing of this. Would you like to explain that to our viewers?
Sure. So Senator Richard Blumenthal, he's a Democratic from Connecticut. He wanted to open an inquiry into the merger of the PGA and LIV Golf because there are antitrust concerns here. Now, the pending antitrust lawsuits between the two organizations come in spite of the controversy. Now, the PGA Tour and LIV Golf are going to be heading, as you mentioned, to the Senate on July 11th. Now, conveniently enough, the man who was running the PGA prior to stepping down for medical reasons will not be there at these meetings. He'll be showing up a week later to return to work. Now, many cited in articles from CNBC to the Washington Post that he was under medical duress, which when you're having this kind of merger, Eugene, where people are vitriolically angry that it's happening, because this is a dramatic reversal of the PGA Tour's position when this happened on June 6th, like an absolute flipping the switch. The PGA Tour is in a very, very bad financial implication. Now, what is a concern and something that I'm hoping will come out in these Senate hearings, were there other bids for this? Were there other offers the PGA Tour entertained? Now, from my point of view and from the reading I've been doing, this kind of, like you said, came out of the blue. It was not something that many people expected, but this is millions of dollars. The Saudi Public Investment Fund has lots of money at their beck and call, really. And the rivalry between these two almost seems to just get thrown under the rug. So I think these Senate antitrust hearings are going to be very, very interesting, considering also both of these entities were in litigation. They're also squashing any pending litigation as part of this plan. So I think not only from a sports business perspective, there are a lot of legal red flags that both of these organizations are going to have to go through to make this merger work. And they still say it's going to be a benefit to the game. Personally, in my humble opinion, I disagree. I don't see how sports washing the PGA Tour is really going to be a benefit, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point about sports washing, and there's been a lot of conversation about that in the context of not just this deal, but I also think about the World Cup last time when it was hosted in Qatar, and that there's I think Saudi Arabia, along with Egypt and Greece, there's a joint bid for 2030. Sports washing, we know that this stuff kind of sort of is like, we want to use sports to kind of paper over the ills, such as they are, in terms of what Saudi Arabia, lots of what Qatar is doing, and a lot of other stuff. What's your reaction to this? Is it inevitable that, like, these countries suffers, but for the purposes of this discussion, Saudi Arabia, are they going to continue to use golf? You remember PGA has been around a long time, as you've mentioned. In the modern version of 1968, the tour, and then the PGA, started. This was spun off from PGA, which started I think in the 1910s, I believe. So what other implications could there be if they enter some of these other leagues in terms of, let's say, MLB, let's do college sports, NIL, that sort of thing? What do you see there?
So it's interesting you bring up college football. So I have to make a reference real quick. I find that this whole PGA Tour+LIV merger, while they're trying to paint it as a merger, it's really like an episode of Succession, Eugene. I don't know if you've seen it. I've seen it. This is exactly what this type of deal is. The PIF has bottomless resources. It is like a brunch in DC with mimosas. You can keep going and going all you want, and the funds do not run out for them. Cristiano Ronaldo was brought to the Saudi National Soccer League for $220 million a season. The PIF also took over Newcastle United in the Premier League to be the British team's majority owner. It also hosted 9 WWE events as well. They've had a Formula One event as well. But now that you mentioned college football, there are tens of millions of dollars in college football. Why wouldn't the Saudis want to become the newest super booster to a lot of college sports programs? Now, it's uncomfortable to say that. It's uncomfortable to hear it. It's uncomfortable to think it. But unfortunately, it is a next step. Now, the interesting thing about these institutions, like when you get to collegiate athletics, that is not really an area you see a ton of sovereign money being handed into their college athletics. They're funded by the NCAA. All of these different schools and Division I programs, Division II and Division III programs as well, do not get their funding from other countries, investment funds. That is unheard of. Now, athletic directors across the country laugh, of course, in their heads, thinking this couldn't happen. But this gives Saudi Arabia and the vast wealth that they have, whether it's college sports, the PGA, the Premier League, you see them going, they think money can solve all their problems. That's what it comes down to, is they think that all of the money they have, all the resources they have can be like, oh, yes, we might, have killed a journalist. And, oh, yes, we've imprisoned women and other activists in our country for doing things that are illegal against our laws. But, look how good this new stadium is. And that's the thing that we always have to keep in mind, is that you have countries, like you said, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, other countries with dubious human rights records, trying to be like, look at this shiny new object I have and ignore everything else. And it's becoming more prolific. You mentioned the World Cup bid. Will Saudi Arabia host a World Cup? You have to ask that question. If the joint bid in a country where women can't drive, you have a lot of female football fans that watch the World Cup. How's that going to be a hospitable environment to them? You have a lot of LGBTQ fans, as we saw in Qatar. That was a huge issue as well. You have all these nations that are really trying to just paper over their past, paper over the things they've done to their own citizens by welcoming in the world. And while some countries are very good at it, Saudi Arabia just happens to be a little bit better.
And that's what it certainly is looking like. I mean, again, I go back to how seismic this is in terms of golf, and I think this broader implications, I think, for the sports world. It is something that is going to be really talked about for sure. I mean, I think to your point with, like, say, Lionel Messi, for example, he's being paid to perform PR, for Saudi Arabia. All expenses paid, that sort of thing. The only proviso is that he cannot tarnish the monarchy. You can't be critical, about this stuff. Otherwise, that money goes away. And that leads to this. What role those principles or integrity have in sports? And is there a certain hypocrisy to all this? I think about Saudi Arabia's human rights record is nothing to, brag about. You won't hear an argument from me on that stuff. But then I want to read this here from The Guardian saying, quote, on the campaign trail in 2019, Joe Biden said that Saudi Arabia would be punished for the murder of Khashoggi and for the brutal war in Yemen, pledging to end the sale of material to the Saudis, where they're going in and murdering children. And, Biden was saying, we were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. But then last year, they sold $3 billion worth of Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, the U.S. says that these are defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. And then you have the commissioner who, as you said earlier on, was against this deal, and now it's like he's for it. And then, Rory McIlroy, you mentioned some of the players, to modify an expression that John Kerry used years ago, he was against this before he was for it. So what do you see here in this? What do you think of some of this hypocrisy going on here?
I think the hypocrisy, and you made some very incredible points, and thankfully Lionel Messi, he ended up going to Inter Miami, so he didn't have to worry about the Saudi Arabia money. But Cristiano Ronaldo, that's the role he's going to fill. Like, when you take money like that, when you sign a contract like that, you and I do not sign $1 million contracts like that. However, we are aware of what goes into it. We're aware of what the fine print can be. We are aware that there are going to be character potential clauses or a morality clause potentially in this contract for Ronaldo. He lives in Saudi Arabia. There are certain things that are not considered moral in Saudi culture, and he probably might have to be more mindful of that. He lived in many different countries where his exploits were quite prolific. Now, Lionel Messi, to briefly go back to that, I believe he did not take the deal in Saudi Arabia because, speaking to numerous outlets, he just didn't want to move his family there, and also makes sense. Now, something that's very interesting that you point out is you see the hypocrisy for so many organizations that get into bed with questionable leagues. Like the Qatari World Cup is a fantastic example of FIFA being bribed, and records of bribes by Sepp Blatter, Gianni Infantino, receiving money, houses, other incentives to essentially give Qatar the bid for the World Cup. You don't typically see that kind of deal making on that level. Of course, in large organizations, to get bids to come to your country, is deal making going on? You and I both know we're not blind to this. Of course it is. But this was next level for FIFA. There's a great documentary everybody should watch about it that really unravels what happened. And the fact that you gave a country a World Cup where thousands of immigrant workers died building these brand new stadiums. Saudi Arabia, I believe, said it was like 15. Qatar said it was about 15. It is more likely in the thousands that have been unreported. You have writers who unfortunately did pass over there or were involved in altercations, may or may not have been because they have outspoken against the Qatari government. So you also have these types of events where you can have world leaders speak out about the murders of, Khashoggi, or the fact that 81 people were beheaded in Saudi Arabia, example, one day in 2022, yet they're still willing to give them their money because they know how lucrative the money is. They're willing to overlook everything. And the Patriot missiles is a great example. America has done this before. We very much like to be the bastion of freedom and, free speech, free press, free expression. And, we are going to be the world police, for lack of better words. And yet we do sometimes these things like giving Patriot missiles to Saudi Arabia that are very questionable, that make you go, that's great. We get mad at other nations when they do stuff like this and involved with other nations that have a dubious human rights record, but we're okay doing it when it's under a guise that fits for us. And I think you're going to see sports leagues do that, especially considering money talks. Money is always going to talk. At the end of the day, it's going to speak the loudest. Just in the past couple of weeks, at Wimbledon's going on right now, Saudi Arabia is contemplating infusing money into the WTA, which is the Women's Tennis Association. You want to put that kind of $650 billion sovereign wealth fund into an organization that is predominantly women in a country where, again, women cannot particularly have the same rights, or necessarily that have the same rights that their male fellow citizens have. And I think it's very interesting. It's one of those like do as I say, not as I do type of things. And when you see that in sports, and when you see them go, we're going to take this money anyway, we're going to put it towards revamping facilities, increasing prize money. Everybody, especially when it comes to women's sports, are going to be like, wow, great, equal prize money. Yeah, but where did it come from? And what is the cost? And how does that sit with a fan base? The questions are still being parsed out, really, because this is the first type of deal to be held like this. And the ATP, they have a next gen final that they play every year, every season. It's in November for like the best players in the industry. They're hosting in Saudi Arabia at some point. The kingdom is going to be visited by some WTA Tour players in February of 2024. And these are interesting conversations. And I want to know your thoughts as well, if you don't mind me asking. Having a women's tennis tour event in a country that notoriously is not female friendly, is this going to be another example of sports washing?
I think it very well may be, Regina. I think that certainly the optics of it are not particularly great because of what you just enumerated. The rights for women, over there versus, what, we have here in the US. I think, of course, there's still more work to be done, I think, in the States and, certainly other, nations in this regard. But I think in totality, this may very well be another example of sports washing. So, I mean, this is going to be stuff that's going to, continue to be talked about, especially as we continue to look at some of this stuff here. And one of the threads, and I want to continue on this thread because I want to play a soundbite for our viewers. This was last year. Jim Nantz, he interviewed the commissioner, Monahan, about the ramifications of joining LIV for the players, because that there were suspensions, and things of that nature. There was lawsuits and things of that nature, which of course that's going to be cast aside, as you said, on the back of this. But let's have a listen to that. I know the 9/11 families, as you said, we're not too pleased with that, but let's have a listen to that portion for our viewers.
Well, I talked to players. I've talked at a player meeting, and I've talked to a number of players individually. For a long period of time. And I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that there are significant implications. And as it relates to the families of 9/11, I have two families that are close to me that lost loved ones. And so my heart goes out to them. And I would ask, any player that has left, or any player that would ever consider leaving, have you ever had to apologize for being a member of the PGA Tour?
Regina, what a difference a year makes. I mean, will players now have to apologize for being on the PGA Tour on the back of this? You'll hear that answer in part 2 of my conversation with Regina in the August edition of this program. So do subscribe to youtube.com/the CSE channel right here so that you are the first to see it when the show drops on the 31st. Now, since we recorded our interview, the Senate hearing on the merger occurred, and one of the big takeaways of this was that the PGA Tour felt they had little alternative but to merge with LIV. Jimmy Dunn, who sits on the PGA Tour's board, stated at the hearing that Senator Blumenthal presided over, quote, "They have an unlimited horizon and an unlimited amount of money. It isn't like the product is better. It's just that there's a lot more money that will make people move. I'm concerned with what the senator is worried about. But I'm concerned if we do nothing, we're going to end up there. They're going to end up owning golf. They can do it." This piece from Golf Digest distilled the nearly 3-hour hearing. We have a link to the entire article in the YouTube description below. But one of the many things that stood out to me, besides the eye-popping amount of money and a non-disparagement clause, is the fact that the PGA Tour wanted a, quote, softball segment with CNBC in announcing the merger. Though they aren't calling it that, but still, LIV advisor Michael Klein stated in part, quote, "The worst thing we can do is have naysayers lead the chorus." Also in August, we'll talk about why the public should care about the fact that Saudi Arabia is involved in this, even those that don't like geopolitics and sports mixing. We'll have those guys care about this as well. So I hope you'll be able to join us. I also wanted you to join us on our Substack page because we've got for you a piece from CSE Media's Alan Brim on the firing of Pat Fitzgerald, formerly of Northwestern University, after a hazing scandal. And we've got a piece from CSE Media's Jesse Dimish-Louvet on the collisions of culture, religion, and music as it pertains to 2 festivals that took place earlier this month in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to be over there, cscmedia.substack.com. Do join us over there right now and subscribe. Folks, we continue to need your help in finding broadcast industry professional and University of Maryland alum Terrence Woods, who's been missing since October of 2018. If you have any information as to Terrence's whereabouts, you're asked to call the Idaho County Sheriff's Office at 208-983-1100. That's 208-983-1100. You can also reach out to us on our social media accounts, which you'll see at the end of the program, and we'll pass any information along to them. And thank you so much for watching. Listen, there's going to be a lot more where that came from, so you better stay tuned to catch it all. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on all of our social media accounts for more information, including all of the bonus content that you'll see from today's show. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell on our YouTube channel so that you do not miss any of our episodes. And please join us on Substack and Patreon and support all of the work that we do here. And until next time, I'm Eugene Obah. Remember, we will not be silenced.